Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So this is one of the presentations from the Embodiment Conference. So I guess many of you know the Embodiment Conference was a huge event over 2 weeks where over 140 speakers led presentations on embodiment. Now, a lot of these were visual. Some of them were more kind of talking based though. We thought, you know what, we could give some of these away as part of the podcast. So listening to this, you may hear references to questions or things in the chat. We've tried to select ones that they're not demonstrating too much visually, obviously. If it piques your interest, you can always buy the full package of Embodiment Conference recordings. It's a bit of an encyclopedia, actually. Embodiment Netflix, someone was calling it. And that is available if you just Google the Embodiment Conference. I'm sure you'll be able to find a link to that. This is one of the speakers, and as I say, it's a bit different. May or may not be me interviewing them, presenting it. It's mostly them just doing their thing, and excuse the sort of occasional references to comments or visual demonstrations. And it just seemed like a lot of the speakers were extremely kind of high-level people, and it's stuff we wanted to make available. So here it is.
We're ready. That is the question. Joseph, are you ready?
I am ready. And I am here. And welcome, everybody. And thanks for having me, as always. Hey, Maud. Yes. Good to be here.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for being with us today. This is a great occasion to work on a topic which I find juicy. So shall I say a few words to introduce you?
Yes, of course, please.
So, Joseph, thank you for being with us. You're a cognitive scientist initially, and you have your expertise lies in transformational communication and some application fields, specifically in the organizational world, in the world of high performance. So you've worked with elite athletes, with artists, with people in the military, including the Marine Corps, if I'm not wrong. You are the architect and designer of the mytho-self process and the Soma-Semantics model, which you're going to introduce to us. Today, you're also a speaker, a writer, and you've done a lot of research on leadership, change and performance. And one of the key things that I think you're known for is working on motivation and communication and how they relate. And so as a transformational artist, I think that's one of the way you like to call yourself. Today, you are about to offer us a session, which I know is going to be highly experiential, working on fear. And so when we were preparing this call, you shared with me how so many change and personal development and professional development methods in the leadership field work with fear, but in a way that they try to convert it quite quickly into something else or get rid of it, put it to the side, get over with it. And I think you want to offer us another perspective today. Would you like to jump right into it, Joseph?
Sure. There you go. I just want to take one quick step back. You said initially I was a cognitive scientist, and the reality is initially I was a street rat and spent a lot of time getting in trouble to some extent. And that led me into, the whole martial arts thing. So embodiment for me was present from a little kid when I was climbing into and falling out of trees and growing up in the city of Newark, New Jersey, and climbing up on rooftops and jumping from one roof to another between buildings. So there was a lot of that going on. Then I spent a
parkour experience to fear, if I understand you.
It was at the time, I was too young to be afraid. I was too ignorant to know that I could possibly get hurt or die. So it was just the thrill of the chase, so to speak, And then grew up a little bit, became an architect, and then finally figured out the stuff that was interesting was the people stuff. And I want to do a couple of things. I want to set a little ground in place for the session I want to do with y'all. And it's that I'm wearing a shirt today specifically because I thought Mark might be on the call. And I know how much he loves Americans, so I wore my shirt. But in addition, Mark, I'm going to go down a little bit further. This is a dude shirt. This is from the Big Lebowski, man. This is an Abide shirt, man. So word for you today, just in case you might be on the call, give you a little Americanism.
He is on the call, Joseph. You got
I see him. I see him there. He's giving me a bunch of signals on the side. And also, I know that, given that it is a conference organized by Mark, we probably have permission to use the word fuck as much as we want. But I use that word only for emphasis. So because it's going to be so common and so used, my expectation is in the course of this conference, I'm not going to use it at all, which will create an emphasis from the non-use of the word, right? So there's a couple of things I want to talk about. And one of them, as I said, is these background notes. And in addition, the idea, this fear premise that I want to speak to in leadership, I think of as an evolutionary advantage. And I think that especially early on in the conference, I asked to be in quite one of the earlier sessions because I think this session has great meaning, not because of what it is for itself, but because it sets a tone or a ground, maybe to listen through a number of the other speakers that will join us. Because we're in a community of fear. We're being manipulated. We're being fed fear on a daily basis in much of the mass media that's out there in all kinds of ways, whether it's through, we could call it the conservative media that's telling us how immigrants or socialists or the entitled people or the minorities are ruining our lives and taking away our futures and the future of our children. And that's being fed down our throats, right? So it's force fed. Or on the other side, the way that we're being confronted by, fascists and neo-Nazis and people who want to take all the goods for themselves and crush the poor and disadvantaged. These are fear-mongering ideas. And if we don't understand how fear becomes present in us and what it actually is and why it's an evolutionary advantage, we lose the edge that fear gives us. So I know that probably over the course of the conference, if you all hang out and you attend many of the sessions, you're going to hear about the idea of modulating the autonomic nervous system between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, especially if you tune in, I'm guessing, to some of the trauma specialists who are going to speak to the idea of how those fear imprints get laid in place and become automatic triggers for that autonomic nervous response into the sympathetic, into fight, flight, freeze. Now, flight, fight, freeze is not the entirety of the sympathetic response. It's an aspect of the sympathetic response. But the problem with it is our thresholds are constantly being manipulated and in fact lowered because of all of the impact of this onslaught of information that's fear-mongering. We have to know what it feels like in our body to experience this fear so that we can use it. Now, I'm going to jump right into the topic of leadership for a moment, and I'll back in and out of this as I go through the time we have together. But in the world of leadership, what I find is this. I work with many different leaders. I've had the privilege of spending 30 years in this space, worked with literally hundreds, maybe thousands of leaders, depending on how you want to count leadership. And I've worked with CEOs of major multinational corporations. I've worked with leaders in the military of special forces units as well as general units. I've worked with entrepreneurs who are leading small to very large companies. I understand something about how leaders perceive themselves and how they experience the world. And what I've found is that I have a definition I like to use, or a concept rather, that I like to use about leadership. What I like to say is that good leaders help people to achieve their full potential. They help them to realize everything they're capable of realizing. Great leaders help people to exceed their potential because what they do is they allow individuals to tap into the collaborative. They allow individuals to tap into something that they themselves actually can't attain on their own, but they can attain alongside others. And it may just be the one-to-one between the leader and the individual that's being led, so to speak, where that dynamic creates something which is greater than either of them possess. Now take that and extend it to a group of 15 or 20 or 200 or 2,000 or 20,000, and the potential becomes greatly exaggerated. It becomes an enormous potential to tap into when we get into this idea of leaders being able to take people beyond their innate potential, to become more than they're capable of being on their own. But to do that, they have to acknowledge the reality of the situations they're facing. Now, in this exploration with leaders that I've had this privilege to be working with, what I find is that some of them, most of them, in fact, avoid fear, or they discount it, or they don't acknowledge it, and they simply move back from it. They don't want to know that fear is present. And especially when they're in front of the troops, so to speak, right? They want to talk about how we're going to get along. It's going to be great. We're going to be a huge success. Nothing can stop us. The world for us is, an open, system that we can do anything we want with, and all that kind of garbage. The reality is that many of these people are experiencing deep-seated fear because they know things to be true that they're not speaking to. This is a problem. This is an issue if it's not confronted and dealt with. Now, on the other hand, great leaders I've worked with acknowledge fear. They walk in front of people and they say, there are unknowns here. There are things that we know, and there are things we simply don't know. And the things that we don't know can always present to us challenges that we at some point need to deal with and must be present to as they arise. And what they get is a magical thing. I like to say this to the clients that I work with. You cannot know what you don't know until you know it. And that's so important to me. I just want to repeat that statement. You cannot know what you don't know until you know it. And yet, 99% of the clients I work with, the people I coach, the people I consult with, all want a sense of certainty about a future that doesn't yet exist. They literally want to know what they can't know before they know it, because it doesn't exist yet. And in fact, they're co-conspirators into bringing whatever it is that's going to exist into being. But they're only co-conspirators. They don't control the universe. I haven't yet met Vishnu. So until I do, I recognize that other people get a vote. The system gets a vote. And because there's an unknown, the way our neural systems are organized, the way our nervous systems are organized, is fear can emerge as a result of what's unknown. It's just that simple. It doesn't have to be something terrible or bad or horrible that exists. It's that we don't know what's going to happen next that creates a level of fear that we have to become aware of. Now, I learned a lot about this as a martial artist. I learned a lot about this as I said, a street rat, fighting in the streets, as well as in organized systems of fighting. And I was a competitive boxer for a while, and I've been studying different forms of martial arts at different times with different people who are phenomenal at what they do. And what I find is they're able to collapse what they experience as the sense of fear into a force of motivation. They use it. They don't let it use them. Now, to get this, you have to begin to think about, what does it actually mean to be afraid? What does it mean to have the sensation of fear? And what does it do? And how does it work within us? So one of the things that typically happens is, as we trigger that sympathetic response, we begin to experience a certain kind of physiological change as well. And again, you may know this, you may have heard about it, you will hear about it if you listen to a number of the conference sessions. And it's got to do with the fact that our breathing can become shallow and tight. The muscles of the thorax, the body process here, contract and shrink and become tight. And it can be hard to breathe. And this sets up an anxiety loop for many people where, because they can't breathe, they feel like they're dying. They feel like the world is closing in on them. And it's horrifying. So they breathe even less. Now it's and eventually the advantage is, don't worry about that. Even if it's happening to you, you'll just pass out. And when you're unconscious, there's no anxiety. And since there's no anxiety, you'll just start breathing. So not a whole lot to worry about there. But in the moment that it's happening, I get it's terrifying. I get that it may be hard to control. And there's some mechanism we can use. The standard thing, you can all play with this now if you want. And you'll see you're going to get a change in the second factor that I like to talk about when I'm referring to the sympathetic system, which is a change in heart rate and a change in blood pressure. And one of the things that almost all people who have been in emergency training, whether they're special forces units or they're EMTs or any of that, they learn to do what's called a 4-4 breathing, where it's a 4 count in, breathing in, 1, 4, hold, 4, out, 4. And that 4-4 breathing actually changes your heart rate. Now, I'll give you something that's a little bit interesting. When we look at what we can call primitive cultures, cultures that have not been saturated with civilization as we understand it, and we look at their breathing rates, it becomes really interesting. So what I'd like to do is I'm just going to take 15 seconds. I'm actually going to put it on my little watch here, and I'm going to count. I'd just like you to count your breaths with me. Whatever number of breaths you have, just breathe normally. Don't do anything fancy. Don't go into your deep tantric meditation states or any of that BS that I know is popular around these environments of embodiment conferences. Just normal. Be a normal human being for 5 seconds and breathe, all right? And I'll count to 15. I'll use my watch. I actually have a little chronograph watch here. I'm going to use it. And when I say start, just count your breaths. Okay, go ahead. Start now. That's about halfway. Just keep counting. And that's 15 seconds now. So whatever number of breaths you have. If you wouldn't mind, just in the chat, 4, 2.5, 3, 2, 4, 5, 3, 2. So if I add up the averages here, 2.5 would give us about 10 breaths in a minute. 6 looks like the high number right now. There's a number of people at 6. So 6 breaths would give us 24 breaths in a minute, 4 times, right? 15 seconds. So here's the thing that's really interesting. When we look at these primitive cultures, their average intake of breath is about 4 per minute at rest. 4. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to time it again. I'm going to give you a count to breathe in and breathe out. Not at 4. 4 is too much for most people. But at 8 breaths a minute. So I'll give you a count. So go ahead and start again when I say breathing in now. Hold it. Hold it. Go ahead and breathe out. And breathe in again now. And hold it. Hold it if you can. And breathe out now. And that's 15 seconds and 2 breaths. So that's 8 breaths a minute. That's twice as much breathing, so to speak, as these quote unquote primitive people seem to need to keep themselves alive and healthy. And what does it mean? It means a whole lot of things. It means, number one, they're probably highly oxygenated from the breathing they do, because they probably use the entire lobe structure of the lungs. They breathe all the way in. They don't breathe in clavicle breaths. They don't breathe just in terms of thoracic breath or rib cage breathing. And they don't just breathe diaphragmatically, because they're not opera singers trying to, get way down in the diaphragm. They use the entire thing. So they breathe into the diaphragm, through the thorax, and up into the clavicle. And that takes time, but also oxygenates the system. This lowers the heart rate. And a magical thing begins to occur. It raises the threshold position of the access to the somatic response to the sympathetic system. So in other words, it's harder to get to that anxiety response when all of these systems are optimized. And you've probably heard a lot about breath if you've been around an embodiment community, whether it's a yoga community or martial arts community or some kind of physical training or whatever it might be. If it's embodied, embodiment people like to talk about breathing. And there's a great reason to talk about breathing, but you've probably heard about it if you've been in this space at all. What's interesting is the correlation between breathing and so much else and the way it alters our mind. And one of the things that's happening when we get into this fear response that we can notice is that our breathing begins to change. We breathe more shallowly and we breathe more quickly. And despite the fact that we're breathing more quickly, we're less oxygenated. And that means, in addition to everything else that might be true, our brains aren't going to work as well. So one of the critical distinctions of fear is that it shuts down our ability to be creative. It shuts down our ability to think through what we're confronting. And we wind up with just 2 choices as it escalates. And that is either to attack and kill whatever it is. I got to kill it, got to make it go away, got to mend it right now, got to kill it, got to kill it, got to kill it. And we see this in some of the frantic conversation that's happening even in the social sphere. How all these people who are against us in terms of ideology, they simply hold a different ideology than we do. They're simply using words that we don't like to hear or don't agree with, or the way they're using the words or the things they're talking about or the way they're referring to other people. We don't like it. We got to kill them, at least as an idea. So while we might not be violent physically, we're being violent socially. And many times what's happening is that violence leads to an emotional coercion, where what we're doing is we're behaving violently towards other people emotionally and compromising and co-opting the emotions that are negatively inhibiting to the system. On the other hand, we can open this up, and when we do have access to creative thinking, our minds are what we call in an excitatory state. And it doesn't mean we're excited. It means that we have the ability to get the neurons to connect and link in ways that are unfamiliar to us. We're willing to expose ourselves to the unknown. And if everything I'm going to say here, if you got just this one idea, then I would be pleased with our time together. That the distinction between the inhibitory and the excitatory states of consciousness are that in the inhibitory, you simply cannot think beyond the immediacy of whatever's present for you in the moment. And it takes over your mind, it controls your responses, and you have no choices in your decisions. You will fall back to the patterns that are most familiar and comfortable to you, even when they don't work. You'll find yourself in loops of failed performance because there's no choice. When your mind is in the excitatory, however, creativity becomes present. And creativity means that you can think beyond the present moment. You can think into a space that doesn't yet exist. And it may never exist because you may come up with 50 or 100 or 1,000 different spaces, of which only one you'll choose to manifest in this next moment. And that manifestation of that creative act creates a possibility that wasn't present before you manifested it. You see, when you're in the inhibitory, the things that you're doing have already happened because you're familiar with them. You know what's going to happen, and that's why you do it, because it's comfortable and it's safe. So in a way, what I'm suggesting to you is that this evolutionary process of fear is designed primarily to keep you safe. And until you acknowledge and respect it, you won't be able to figure out what you really need to be safe from and what's a real threat. And if we don't recognize the distinction between real threats and false threats, we're going to be ending up in this inhibitory posture where we cannot think, where we have no choice, where we're making bad and false decisions in an ongoing way. And yes, the breath has something to do with it, right? So we want to really be clear about how do we get into an excitatory state? What does that mean? Now, the second most important thing that I want to tell you, right? I'm going to have a bunch of really important things, all that you must remember and memorize. You must take notes and put all of these down in the most critical place that you keep things like this.
Yeah,
right?
Joseph. Yeah. I told you in advance I may do that. Tempted to intervene here because there is so much in what you teach us today, Joseph. It's really intense and rich.
The most optimal way for breathing is the one that in the moment that you're breathing is most comfortable for you. The only thing I would recommend is, to some extent, just be aware that you're breathing as fully as is comfortable for you, and don't put a whole lot of attention on it. Unless you're doing something specifically with your breath, your body will do what it needs to do in most cases to optimize your breathing, unless there's some organic issue. And I'm going to assume for the moment that's not what you're asking me, and I'm not necessarily qualified to answer that in any case. It's definitely helpful to note what kicks us into faster breathing, because that's going to be one of the triggers that kicks you into, quote unquote, kicks you into this fear response that we're going to talk about, and not to try to avoid it. This is really an important point I'm trying to make here, is do not try to avoid the fear response. You want to be able to recognize that it's a signal to alert you to what the heck is going on in the environment, right? Ignoring the fear response is how people walk down the street, get a sensation or an intuition about something, and then get hit in the back of the head because they didn't pay attention to it, when they simply could have turned around and looked at who was behind them, right? So I said I spent a lot of time around the martial arts. The best, most powerful skill you can develop as a martial artist is probably situational awareness. To not be where the danger is way more useful than having the best martial arts skill on the planet. If somebody's not around to hit you, you don't have to have any particular skills to not get hit or to hit them back, right? So situational awareness, huge if you want to be, in the world in a way that you're comfortable and safe, whether that's from other people or situational, emergent things that are going on around you, know where the exits are, something simple like that, right? And avoid situations that are likely to be aggravating. So that's why it's important to pay attention to those signals, like your increased breathing rate. Yeah. See, Christine, you're asking a question here that I tried to address peripherally, which is, what if I'm breathing badly due to trauma, sustained fear, and muscle memory? That's a very big question, and it would take a whole nother session. And I'm hoping that in the process of the Embodiment Conference at large, we're going to hear from a lot of real experts who have specific skills in those kinds of questions in dealing with it, especially the trauma course. And I would try to tune into that if I were you. You were going to say something, Maud?
Yeah, we do have great experts in the trauma track.
Right. I tend to work with this on the other side, Christine, which is my clients are not yet particularly traumatized. So I do a lot of work with people, for instance, going into combat theaters, and I teach them how not to get traumatized before it happens. So I don't want to claim expertise I don't have and being to step into other people's space where they have great expertise. But there are techniques that I know of. There are people I've been around who are brilliant at this, who do great work in this area, and I'm sure you can get some input if you stick around and tune into those people. All right.
Thank you,
Okay,
Joseph.
so let me kind of, more again, please.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph, for including this integration time. Most useful, I think.
Okay. So I do want to jump back into this other side of the conversation. I've been trying to explain why I think fear is so powerful and useful to us, because it does alert us to the situation that we're in. We want to begin to notice these kind of tickling responses in our body. Hey, something's going on, right? Like there's something going on, and I know it and I feel it, even though I don't yet know what it is, even though I can't pinpoint this or that. I don't want to shut down that experience and go, oh, it must be nothing because I looked around, I can't see anything. There's nobody here. I don't hear anything that's bothering me. And I'm having a good day and I ate well and I slept 8 hours or whatever. Trust those instinctive sensations that trickle up through the body and titillate you into a higher level of awareness. This is really critical stuff. And if we can get there, you can take this next step I'm about to speak of. So the next step is we have a way of being in the excitatory, of being in this creative space that's innate and natural to us. And I'm going to kind of walk you through it really quickly. This is the basis of a model that I built starting in the early 1990s. I was working with a gentleman, Roy Frazier, who developed this process called the Generative Imprint. And Roy was a 25-year combat veteran of Israel's army during the 1950s and 60s. So that's when he began his service. And if you want to know anything about Israel's history, that was what we could call an active time for soldiering, right? And the thing that he learned was there was something that he perceived, especially around the older soldiers, the ones who had been through a lot of combat, about how they access kind of a sensation of life, literally, a way of knowing they were alive and using that to modulate their experience in an ongoing way, even in incredibly stressful and threatening situations. Again, not avoiding the sensation of threat or fear or stress, but modulating it through this sensation that he called the generative imprint. I took that work and began to introduce it into a model that I was building, the myth-o-self process. And what we found in developing this model was that the access to what I call ontological ground, and I know I'm using fancy words, I'll get past that. I see Mark shuddering already. It's just the idea of the ground of being. That's what I mean by ontological ground, the way you are before anything else exists. And this is kind of swimming in the space of consciousness. And I don't want to get too metaphysical or spiritual. And again, just talk about it as a practicality. There's something that's true of you before anything is true of you. You simply are. Anything we can do, anything that we think, anything that we experience requires us to exist in the first place. The ontological ground is the basis of that existence. And in that, there is an innate way that you know you are alive. There's an innate way that you can access that. So there are moments in our lives where this simply becomes present for us. For me, one of those moments was at the birth of my children. And it was two radically different experiences. My son was born via cesarean section, and this little head popped out of the abdomen. I was there in the operating room, although they didn't want me to be, but that was not an option for me not to be there. And when it did, there was a flood of a sensation of connection to something that was so transcendent, so much more than me standing in the universe as a separate, distinct entity that I felt. And I can't describe it better than that. The same thing was true when my daughter was born. My daughter was born at home naturally and, just natural childbirth. Same thing, though. In that moment where this new being emerged from the womb of her mother, I was present to something that was extraordinary and astounding. And I don't know how to explain it. I don't know, for instance, if I'd feel the same thing if I was present to the birth of someone else's child. I think there's something magical in these kinds of moments. moments. And for you, it might be something else. It might be a birthday that you experience surrounded by people that you care about. It might be sitting down at a local pub and having a beer with a great friend and just reaching a moment where you realize you're present to something that's significant in some way. Or it might be that you've done something as simple as having a good day and reflecting on the course of that day, and you realize in that moment that you're alive. There's this sensation that if life could be like this, just kind of get this phrase, if life could be like this, it would be perfect. In these moments, it feels as though we cannot put a foot down wrong, that everything is going to work out for us. And these moments are somatically organized. Now, I'd like you to literally think about just one of those moments, not a category of moments, not about what it feels like to feel good, but literally a moment in your life where you had one of these extraordinary peak experiences where it felt like you couldn't put a foot down wrong. If life could be like this, it would unfold for you perfectly. And do whatever it might need to be done so that you can have this sensation, and then notice, weird kind of question here, where in your body it is. Where is the sensation in your body that you're aware of being most alive? And I want you to get it down to as small as the most minute aspect of awareness as you can, down to a cellular level if you can. Because what I found in the work that I do is that this is literally happening as a kind of what we call skin memory in the actual muscle fibers. So we are looking for, when I'm doing work with people, micromuscular movement, literally a twitch at the level of the surface of the skin where the muscle, as I go to move my arm, begins to fire to create the structure so that movement can occur. So this, compared to what I'm looking for, is gross movement. That's a little better. That movement, where all I did is create a little more tension in my arm, is closer to that micromuscular movement. So you want to be aware at the most minute level where that sensation is when you feel spectacular, when you know all bars hold, you are magnificent. You cannot put a foot down wrong. Comes from horse racing, by the way, where the idea is that the horse in that race could not put a foot down wrong. It just ran all out and was its most magnificent self. And now all of a sudden, you're having this experience and it's somewhere in your body. And I want you to notice what happens as that experience continues, right? And it's going to either intensify, or it's going to localize more, or it's going to spread, but something will happen if you can allow your awareness to be where the sensation of what I'm calling this kind of sensation of life being magnificent or perfect begins from. And I want you to check something for me. Could you be like this and be overwhelmed by fear? Or if you were like this, would it be possible to be in the presence of something that's threatening or stressful or fearful, something that you could acknowledge as going, holy crap, this is something I need to be aware of and attend to. There's a real potential here for something to happen that I don't want to be happening, and still be present in a creative way. So if we're doing this correctly, so to speak, what happens is we now enter into, we're in the excitatory. We're in this idea of what sometimes is referred to as presence, being present and being in presence, but we're doing it at a very somatic, physical level. And it's not that the fear thing doesn't exist. 100 years ago, in my own history, I talked a little bit about being a street rat and a fighter and an architect. Well, between architecture and cognitive science, I spent about 4 years training dogs. And I worked with this guy, Bob Brandow, who's absolutely insane and brilliant simultaneously. And he has the most magnificent, what we call phrasing in the world of dog training. It means he moves around the animals in such a way that they naturally resonate and move with him. It's unbelievable, his ability to integrate with these animals. And I learned from him. I kind of spent 4 years apprenticing with him. I have a thing about apprenticing with geniuses. And so working around Bob, one of the things I noticed and learned was that these signals being sent somatically are impossible to avoid or ignore. And the dogs that we were training were dogs that were being trained for high-level protection work at kind of sophisticated employment. So we were placing them with families that really needed protection dogs, that were really essentially at risk. And these dogs were designed to protect their homes. And at the same time, while they could protect them and do real damage if they needed to, hang around with their 2-year-old children or their infants and be totally secure, no danger. So these dogs were able to regulate that aggression and that affection absolutely under the circumstances. And what I did a lot in those days is I was learning to do what we call agitation. Agitation means getting the dog to be aggressive. So you do things to look like a criminal, or whatever. Not actually that, but you get the idea. What I did is I was coming in on these dogs and very aggressively being intense with them so that they would, what we call, light up or fire up or get all charged up, and they would want to be aggressive towards what I was demonstrating. And I can tell you, the dogs we were working with were mostly, by the way, pit bulls. About 90% of the dogs we worked with were pit bulls. And when a pit bull bites you, even with a sleeve on, and the only sleeves you wore were small leather sleeves, it hurts like heck. And it puts you on your toes. And even with the sleeve on, it was not pleasant, and I was a bit afraid. The other problem was, because we were only wearing a little leather sleeve, I had to make sure the dog bit the sleeve and not me. And I knew if it bit me, I'd be in real trouble. So the fear that was present there was not, there was no need to make it believe with it. There was no false fear. It was real, absolute fear. And believe me, the dogs understood the guy who's coming in doesn't want to get bit. They could feel it coming off me in waves. I'm sure I stunk of fear. And it was probably enough that even humans would have been able to smell the fear coming off me at that moment. But I did it anyway because that was part of the process of training these dogs. And I was learning how to do it, and I was getting good at it. And in fact, I have a few stitches I could point to that are there from those learning days, right? In any case, what I'm getting to here is that fear is real. And yet, as I learned more, as I became more comfortable with that fear being present, I had more choices. I could respond more creatively. I could do more with the dogs and with the person who was handling the dog so that we could increase their skill, the dog's skill, in recognizing the distinction between threat and non-threat. And eventually I got to the point where I could do things like have the dog run at me off leash and bite me from 20, 30, 50 yards away and deal with what was happening, which was a compression of all that fear into a microsecond or two of time, where I had to make the decision about where exactly to place my arm so that I would remain injury-free. And I'm here and the arms are still working. And in fact, there are no scars on them. So obviously, I'd figured it out at some point. And this is what I'm talking about. That moment where you know absolutely that you're able to act creatively even in the face of fear and recognize the fear that's there and the potential risk or threat that comes with it. Does this make sense to you, what I'm saying? That there's a way we can access ourselves where we actually have this moment of magnificence. And in that moment of magnificence, there's a way that we are. And that way that we are is somatically grounded. It's literally present in our bodies. And if we allow that to lead how we're allowing our thought process to emerge, we have choices, options, and creativity that's not available otherwise, right? And what I'm going to add here, and this is the critical part about this part of the conversation that I want to have with you, the time to practice this is not when the dog is running at you to eat you. It's when you're calm and you're cool and you're in a totally controlled environment and you don't need to practice not being afraid because you're not. You want to access this state of being, this highly potent, magnificent state, when you have the ability to put all of your attention there because there isn't anything threatening or fearful or stressful happening beyond the ordinary. Life itself may be frightening, threatening, stressful, but beyond the ordinary. And you're going to learn to attune to this sensation of magnificence or perfection or exquisiteness or the excitatory state, however you want to reference it. And if you'll do this and you'll condition the nervous system, the neural system, and the processes of the neural system, and a lot of this has to do with what we call vagal response. If you'll condition this in a setting that you have control over, you'll have access to it when you need it and you're not in control, where the world is showing up in a way where you just are pleased that you spent the 3 times a day for 3 weeks running this process so your body became so familiar with it that it became the default pattern. And that's largely what I do when I'm working with clients. That's largely what I do when they come into my programs and they train with me. It's largely what I do when I go into companies and corporations and work with the leaders, is I teach them how to access this position of magnificence. And it's not just the process to slow the breath down. This is a full body, toes to nose experience of a somatic position that literally becomes present in you when you are at a magnificent posture, when you are what we could call your best self, when you're accessing this position of massive creativity and the excitatory. I would say that this is something that I see happening for people in programs that we run instantaneously. When they get it, they just get it. It's just present. And the question becomes, all I have to do, Joseph, is this? And I go, yeah. Fundamentally, all you have to do is this, but you have to condition it so it's available to you when it's normally not. You see, it's available to you when your child's being born. It's available to you when you're having that great day with a friend of yours and you're sitting back and laying back because you're explaining how great the day went for you over a beer. It's there for you after you make the best goal of your life in a game that you're engaged in. It's there for you in those moments. I get that. It's not there for you when you're under threat. It's not there for you when the boss is giving you a bunch of garbage about what's going on, or you're the boss and there's a bunch of garbage coming at you and you have to deal with it in an ongoing way, or it's been a bad day for your kid or your spouse or your lover. Then it's not so easy to access these moments. So that's why you have to practice it when you're not in those moments, when you're in the moments of comfort and ease, and you can manifest it. And yes, breathing helps. But it's not the only thing you need to know. You need to know all of these little subtle micro movements. Now, eventually, what will happen if you practice this, you're going to notice something really unique and powerful coming up. And it's going to be that there's a kind of movement that your body will want to engage. Now, it might be a gross movement like the one I'm demonstrating to make it obvious to you, frankly. And I find myself like wanting to do things. I want to kind of reach out into the world when I do this. And I'll say this when I'm speaking. I'm in front of a group of people and I go, listen, there's something I want you to know. And there's this kind of gesture I make. And that gesture is a signal to me through my body. I'm okay. I got this. I'm in control. Right? For other people, there might be other things they do. They might do something like this, or they might do something really subtle, or even subtler. But there's a signal that your body will generate, right? And if we watch in athletics, this is really interesting to watch. We watch, guys organizing their bodies to be ready. And when I use the word guys, I mean of any genitalia, right? It's not necessarily a male comment. So what's happening is that I watch people organize themselves to be magnificent. And I watch this in sports, especially just because it's so obvious there. I remember years ago when I was a kid, because I'm an old man now, and a guy named John McEnroe was playing tennis. And he would go out onto the court and he would bounce the ball twice and he would catch it. He'd bounce it again, he'd catch it, and then he'd serve. It was almost like a routine that he installed in himself that reset him, regardless of what had happened the moment before. What had happened to the point before was irrelevant. He was now in that moment to reset. I've worked with some golfers, and golfers are really unique creatures when it comes to needing to reset after the shot they just took. And the great ones know exactly how to do it, and they normally have a routine. I said I was a competitive boxer, so I've watched a lot of boxers. Watch them do stuff like this. They go out and they're shaking their head, and they're doing something. They're not just doing this to loosen the muscles. They're doing this because it organizes themselves. They know that feeling just before going in the ring and what it's like to organize themselves, and then they turn on. And they're there. And you can watch them. There's almost like this steely, absolute presence of certainty when a boxer is able to sustain that internal position and they are looking at their opponent. There's other times where you can see the false confidence they have, where they're manifesting confidence, and it's a completely different thing. But there's something that your body will allow you to recognize that comes through when you can access these positions and allow yourself to become aware of what that thing is that you're noticing. This is the embodiment piece, is that your body is signaling your mind, your brain, so that you can do these things. And I said this is linked into this thing we call the vagal response, the system of the vagus nerve that links the enteric neural system in the abdomen, the intestines, the stomach, the gut, with the neural system that's cranial in your head, in your skull. And the vagus nerve is a really interesting thing because when we look at the signal sets coming through the vagus nerve, what we find is that the vast majority of them, up to 90% of the signaling through the vagus nerve, is from the enteric to the cortical, to the cranial system, not the other way around. What does that tell us? That tells us that the enteric system leads. If the system signals are from the enteric to the cranial, it means that the enteric is leading the cranial system, at least with regard to vagal response. There are neuroscientists who are out there right now who believe it's very, very possible that what's going on is that the cranial system was evolved in service to the enteric system, not the other way around. That our primary neural system is the enteric system. And what I want you to have a little bit of experience as we close out, as we get closer to finishing up, is that vagal response is connected to breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, all of these things that we look at when we're looking at the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Remember, in the sympathetic, you have fight, flight, freeze, and the system eventually closes down when it's overwhelmed. In the other system, the parasympathetic, the system opens. And as the system opens, things become available as simple as digestion and orgasm. So if you want to orgasm, this is really, really good stuff to learn. Okay, just a little side note there. And one of the things you can do is you can allow the enteric system to operate, because I want you to just do one thing with me. It'll take me about 2 minutes to do this, so we should have enough time. I want you to notice whatever you're noticing right now that starts at the top of your head, and how literally you feel in your body, and then working through, almost like a CAT scan, taking layers through your body, where you have contraction and where you have relaxation in the body, where there's any residual tension in the musculature. And allow yourself just to notice it. I'm not asking you to change it. Stop with this idea you should be changing shit. That's not what this is about. It's simply noticing how you're organized in this moment. And slice bit by bit through the noticing process of how you are all the way down through your body, and especially at the point where you cross from the upper thoracic region, the upper body, your torso, into the hips, right? So you want to notice this transition point, because that's a major point, especially if you're sitting, the way that you're operating your body and the level of contraction and relaxation in various muscles, side, front, back, through your system, all the way down through your hips, your legs, again, through the major joint of the knee, into the calf muscles and the ankles, and all the way down to your feet. Just notice how they feel. And now do the same thing in reverse order, starting with your toes. Literally, just begin to come up and notice where you have relaxations and contractions. And allow yourself to notice, if you notice those same things, those same places of relaxation and contraction in both directions, down and up. And just by noticing them, you may also notice that they begin to change. And now I want you to do it one more time, but this time I want you to do it in a little funkier way and faster. I want you to notice on just the right side of your body, so kind of split your body, where the contractions are and where the relaxations are. And as soon as you notice anywhere where there's a contraction or a relaxation that's noticeable, just check the opposite side of the body and notice if it's the same on that side of the body as well. Just notice. Do it quickly. And then when you get down all the way to your toes, go all the way back up, but this time start by noticing on the left side of your body, the left side. And again, where you notice any significant contraction or relaxation, just notice if it's equal. Notice if it's equal on the other side of your body. And then get all the way up to the top of your head again. Last part of the exercise. Just go down one more time and equalize left and right sides. So wherever there's any contraction, just relax it to the point where it's as relaxed as the opposite side of your body. So the right side is now leading the left side where there's relaxations. When you get down to the bottom, come back up again, letting the left side lead the right side. So you're having an equal number of experiences left and right side of your body. Now, at some point, you may notice as you're doing this that you want to breathe more deeply. You may want to stretch. You may want to yawn. There's a number of things that can happen, but what's happening is you're beginning to normalize the system in the physical space that you're occupying. But I mostly want you to notice as we're finishing up this particular exercise, has it changed at all the way that you're thinking about being here with me? Because regardless of the fact that we're separated by this virtual experience, you're here with me, I'm here with you. I'm experiencing you as we share this space. I can't help it. I don't think I'm talking to a camera with nobody behind it. I think I'm talking to a camera with a whole bunch of people behind it. I think I'm talking to you. And so that changes the way I experience myself being present in this moment. And I'm wondering if in any way this little exercise, this final little bit that I'm offering you has begun to change how you're thinking about being in the space. So this is just some of the things that we can talk about and how you might manifest access in this space where fear can take over. And the thing that I want you to get, as I said at the very beginning, is that we live in a space that's saturated with messages of fear or messages designed to provoke fear. Literally, I believe with absolute conviction that we live in a space that's designed to keep us on edge and to keep us afraid, to keep us separate and fragmented, to separate us from our natural state of magnificence. Because in that state, we're fucking dangerous. That's the problem. When we're in our natural state of magnificence, we can be creative, we can think, we can make decisions for ourselves. It's hard to lead us around. And all of a sudden, of its own accord, the ring that was through our nose falls out to the ground, shattering the silence of control. And we begin to have a life that we're destined to lead if we can simply come to know what it is to be ourselves. And that's the essence of the work that I do, whether I'm doing it with any individual on the planet or leaders who are responsible for guiding others to the potentiality that they can only manifest when they're present to one another and can never manifest by themselves alone. So I hope some of this was useful to y'all. I'm going to make 2 recommendations, both of them incredibly self-serving, but I hope they're also useful to you. The first one is that if you want a bit more about the process I'm describing, especially this myth-of-self process, I wrote a book. It's called The State of Perfection. It's available everywhere in the world. Every book, no, I'm only kidding. It's available on Amazon.com and Amazon.co.uk and all these other places. It's called The State of Perfection. And literally what I do is I take a transcript of running a 2-day workshop and I dissect it side by side with the transcript about why I'm saying what I'm saying to the participants in that transcript, in that training. And it will guide you through this process. If you simply read the book, you'll have more of the experience that I've been sharing with you today. If it's been useful, that's a really cheap and easy way to get it. The second thing that I would offer you is that if you're interested in any of the stuff I do, more than happy to establish contact with you. I have a very sophisticated, clever name for my website. It's josephriggio.com. Feel free to go there. It's a great way for us to connect. I'd love to make connection with you. I have a lot of stuff that I like to give away too. So when you get there, you'll get stuff for free. And also I like to make money. So I have programs that I run and trainings around the world. You're invited to join me on those if it makes sense to you. But most of all, I hope that this was useful to you and that you don't necessarily need to take those extra steps to have gotten value from our time together.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you for your generosity. What a bounty we received in less than an hour. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. So there's a quick question here from Dave. Looks like Osana, asking, wondering if referring to fear and violence early on in the talk might trigger some listeners, causing them to shut down before they learn to open up. Absolutely, definitely intentional. This is not a 2-minute presentation. This was an hour presentation. And this presentation is about how not to ignore fear, but to acknowledge it. It's to have the experience of fear. I hope to God I caused some of you to have that sensation of fear somewhere along the way in this hour, because that's my whole frickin' point, is that you want to get to the level in your life where you can be present to fear and not run the fuck away, right? You want to be able to be present to fear and do something with it. You don't want to be triggered by the sense that you should be afraid of being afraid. So, Dave, I totally get it. And I appreciate that for some people that would be absolutely the wrong way to go, wrong message, not their message. But it is my message. And I'm not for everyone. But I can tell you that the people who align and resonate with what I have to say typically come back to me and go, you know what? Makes a lot of sense. I'm going to encounter situations which are going to be uncomfortable and might engender fear in me or people around me. And knowing what to do in those moments might make the difference, literally between life and death, if it's that critical. So if I cause somebody to be afraid and it shuts you down a little bit, deal with it. No apology from me on this one. But I do hope that what I offered you after the fact about what's present when that's occurring and how to deal with it offered you some opening to be able to release that a little bit and become present to, oh, shoot, that's what it's supposed to do. Wake me the fuck up. And just reading some of these other things. There was one more little thing here. How does this relate to young, usually men? Joyriding, racing cars. There is fear, which is exciting, and I can imagine they often feel magnificent, yet they are putting themselves and others at great risk. Only the other people on the track, who I assume are there, intentionally, unless they're doing it on Avenue P in Newark like I did when I was a kid. And then we just make sure that the people who shouldn't be there get the hell off the street. They shouldn't be in front of us when we're racing our cars down the street. What the hell's wrong with them? Don't they know better? Didn't they hear us coming? What the heck, right? So the point that I'm making here is that, there is a sense of thrill that comes with fear. It's an adrenaline drop, and that adrenaline charges up and makes us ready. That's why fear is so freaking powerful, is it readies us to take action. And because we live in a freaking little cocoon safe world most of the time, that's unnatural, by the way. We don't have a natural response to fear. We don't have a natural way of accessing these moments of the adrenaline rush. So we create them. We got to, go down the slope of a hill on little pieces of wood or now resin and plastic and carbon fiber at 400 miles an hour towards trees to feel like we're alive. Grow up in the jungle. You don't need that stuff. There's plenty of stuff to let you know you're alive. You better watch where you're taking that next step. So this is natural. It's part of the evolutionary process. Yes, they are at great risk. And part of the process is the ones who make it through continue to contribute to the gene pool. We've also messed that up a lot, but that would be totally politically incorrect to get into, and I just won't go there. But there was a reason why the ones who couldn't figure out how to make it through the jungle and back home to mom and dad didn't have any kids, right? And the ones who did, they're our grandparents. They're our great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, and they passed along the traits that allow us to survive those dangerous, risky situations. Thank God for them.
Joseph, thank you so much for the generosity of your teaching, for the good triggering that you offered us. Hopefully for all of you, it was a great learning experience with some takeaways you can apply immediately. Now is the end of our time together.
Subscribe to get more, and you can also leave us a review on iTunes, which helps with our rankings, so really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support the podcast even more, then fund us. Go to Patreon, give us $1 per episode. Those who don't know, Patreon's a really good way of supporting things you want to see more of in the world. I know so much is available for free now, and what I'd say is a lot of energy and effort goes into this podcast. I put it out there for free so everyone can get it. More than I work on this. Everyone that wants it can have it for free. And if you want to support us, it is really appreciated. So it's patreon.com/Mark Walsh. And of course, if you want any in-person training, you can visit embodiedfacilitator.com. There's loads more resources there too.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.